There's a moment that comes to everyone. You're in the middle of an emotional storm, your thoughts racing in circles, your heart pounding with anxiety or anger or despair, and suddenly you realize that you're not experiencing life. You're being lived by your emotions. Your thoughts aren't serving you, they're controlling you. Your feelings aren't informing your decisions, they're making your decisions for you. In that moment of recognition, you glimpse something profound, the difference between having emotions and being had by them, between thinking thoughts and being thought by them. This is the threshold where true mastery begins. For over 2,000 years, Stoic philosophers have understood something that modern psychology is just beginning to rediscover. Emotional and mental mastery isn't about suppressing feelings or controlling thoughts through force. It's about developing a fundamentally different relationship with the movements of your inner world. It's about becoming the conductor of your psychological orchestra, rather than being tossed around by every fluctuation in your mental weather patterns. Marcus Aurelius, the most powerful man in the ancient world, wrote his personal notes about managing his own inner life while simultaneously governing an empire, commanding armies, and dealing with political intrigue. Epictetus, who lived as a slave and knew powerlessness in every external way, developed teachings about inner freedom that have influenced minds for millennia. Seneca, navigating the treacherous politics of imperial Rome, learned to maintain philosophical equanimity while his life hung in the balance of a madman's whims. These weren't men who lived in emotional vacuums. They were human beings who faced the full spectrum of psychological challenges and discovered reliable methods for maintaining inner mastery. Today, we're going to explore 10 specific rules that these masters of inner life developed for governing emotions and thoughts. These aren't temporary techniques or quick fixes, but fundamental principles for restructuring your relationship with your own consciousness. They work not by eliminating difficult emotions or stopping challenging thoughts, but by changing your position relative to them. And if you find value in this exploration of inner mastery, I encourage you to subscribe and share in the comments which rule feels most immediately relevant to your current psychological challenges. Your engagement helps these insights reach others who might be struggling with their own inner storms. The first rule is what I call the rule of the observer self. This rule states that you are not your thoughts. You are the one who observes your thoughts. You are not your emotions. You are the consciousness that experiences emotions. This distinction is not philosophical hair-splitting, but the foundation of all psychological freedom. Most people live in complete identification with their mental and emotional content, experiencing every thought as truth and every emotion as command. The Stoics discovered that this identification is optional and, when dissolved, creates enormous space for conscious response rather than automatic reaction. Epictetus taught his students to practice stepping back from their immediate experience and observing it with the curiosity of a scientist studying an interesting phenomenon. When anger arises, instead of being consumed by anger, you notice. Anger is arising in this consciousness. When anxious thoughts spin, instead of being swept away by anxiety, you observe, anxious thinking is happening right now. This shift from identification to observation is subtle but revolutionary. It creates what psychologists now call metacognition, awareness of your own mental processes, which is the prerequisite for any kind of meaningful change. The practice begins with simply noticing when you're lost in thought or emotion and gently returning to the position of observer. You don't judge the content as good or bad. You simply recognize, this is what's happening in my inner world right now. Over time, this practice creates a stable center of awareness that remains calm even when the contents of consciousness are turbulent. You begin to experience emotions as weather patterns moving through the sky of awareness rather than as fundamental truths about reality. The second rule is the rule of initial impressions, which teaches that your first reaction to any situation is not your final reaction unless you choose to make it so. The Stoics understood that initial impressions are automatic and largely outside our control. But what we do with those impressions is entirely within our power. Someone cuts you off in traffic, and your immediate reaction might be anger. Someone criticizes your work, and your instant response might be hurt or defensiveness. Someone shares good news, and your first feeling might be envy. These initial reactions are human and natural, but they're not commands that must be obeyed. Marcus Aurelius practiced what he called the discipline of assent, carefully examining his initial impressions before allowing them to become settled judgments. He would notice his first reaction to an event and then ask, "Is this impression accurate? Is it helpful? Is it based on facts or assumptions? What other ways might I understand this situation?" This pause between impression and judgment creates space for wisdom to operate instead of being driven purely by reactivity. The practical application of this rule involves developing what you might call emotional patience, the ability to feel your initial reaction without immediately acting on it or accepting it as truth. When you feel hurt by someone's words, you can notice the hurt while also questioning whether their words actually say more about them than about you. When you feel excited about a new opportunity, you can appreciate the excitement while also examining whether your enthusiasm is based on realistic assessment or wishful thinking. This doesn't mean becoming emotionally flat or overly analytical. It means becoming emotionally intelligent. The third rule is the rule of voluntary discomfort, which involves deliberately seeking small challenges to build your capacity for handling larger difficulties with equanimity. The Stoics understood that psychological strength, like physical strength, develops through progressive resistance training. If you only encounter challenges when they're forced upon you by circumstances, you're always operating in emergency mode, using fear and adrenaline rather than skill and wisdom to navigate difficulty. Seneca regularly practiced voluntary poverty, eating simple foods and sleeping on hard surfaces, not because he believed comfort was evil, but because he wanted to know he could be content without luxury. Marcus Aurelius would deliberately place himself in situations that tested his patience and philosophical principles. Epictetus taught his students to seek out opportunities to practice virtue under pressure, rather than waiting for life to provide those opportunities randomly. Modern applications of this rule might involve taking cold showers to build tolerance for discomfort, having difficult conversations instead of avoiding them, or choosing the harder path when you have options. The point isn't to make life unnecessarily difficult, but to build confidence in your ability to handle difficulty gracefully. When you know you can be content with less, you become less anxious about losing what you have. When you know you can handle discomfort, you become less controlled by the need to avoid it. The fourth rule is the rule of emotional archaeology, which involves investigating the deeper sources of your emotional reactions rather than simply managing their surface expressions. Most people try to control emotions by suppressing them or changing them directly. But the Stoics understood that emotions are usually symptoms of underlying beliefs and judgments. If you want lasting emotional mastery, you need to examine the root assumptions that generate particular emotional patterns. Persistent anger often reveals beliefs about how people should behave or how life should unfold. Chronic anxiety frequently stems from assumptions about what you need to be safe or successful. Recurring sadness might point to attachments to outcomes or identities that are inherently temporary. Instead of fighting the emotions directly, you investigate the thoughts and beliefs that produce them. You ask yourself, what would I have to believe for this emotion to make perfect sense? What assumptions about myself, others, or life am I operating from that generate this particular feeling? This archaeological process often reveals that your emotional reactions are based on beliefs you adopted unconsciously, perhaps in childhood or during difficult experiences, that may no longer serve your growth or happiness. Once you identify these underlying beliefs, you can examine them consciously and choose whether to continue operating from them. This doesn't mean you can simply think your way out of all difficult emotions, but it does mean you can address emotions at their source rather than just managing their symptoms. The fifth rule is the rule of present moment supremacy, which recognizes that mastery over emotions and thoughts is only possible in the current moment. The past exists only in memory, and the future exists only in imagination, but your actual power to think, feel, choose, and act exists only now. Most emotional suffering involves consciousness being displaced from the present moment, either rehashing past events or anticipating future scenarios, and this displacement always involves a loss of agency and power. Marcus Aurelius wrote extensively about the discipline of the present moment, not as a meditation technique, but as a practical strategy for maintaining psychological effectiveness. When your mind wanders into regret about past decisions, You're using present moment energy to re-experience events that no longer exist. When your thoughts spiral into anxiety about future possibilities, you're depleting current resources to fight battles that may never materialize. The Stoics discovered that keeping consciousness anchored in present reality maximizes both peace and power. The practice involves gently but persistently returning attention to what's actually happening right now whenever you notice your mind time traveling. This doesn't mean ignoring the future or dismissing the past, but recognizing that planning happens in the present and learning from experience happens in the present. All actual living, thinking, choosing, and responding happens in the present. When you train your mind to operate from present moment awareness, you discover that you have far more psychological resources available than you realized. The sixth rule is the rule of emotional alchemy, which teaches that difficult emotions can be transformed into wisdom, strength, and compassion rather than simply endured or avoided. The Stoics didn't view challenging emotions as problems to be solved, but as raw materials to be refined. Anger can be alchemized into clarity about your values and boundaries. Fear can be transformed into prudent preparation and deeper self-knowledge. Sadness can be refined into appreciation for what you've loved and lost. This alchemical process requires a fundamentally different approach to difficult emotions than either suppression or indulgence. Instead of pushing emotions away or being consumed by them, you work with them as a craftsperson works with raw materials. You ask, what is this emotion trying to tell me about what matters to me? How might this feeling be serving my growth or understanding? What wisdom is embedded in this difficult experience that I might not be seeing clearly? Seneca wrote about his own emotional struggles not as failings to be ashamed of, but as opportunities to deepen his philosophical understanding. He discovered that the emotions he initially wanted to eliminate often contained crucial information about his attachments, expectations, or areas where he needed to develop greater strength or wisdom. This doesn't mean romanticizing suffering or believing that all pain has a purpose, but recognizing that conscious engagement with difficulty often produces insights and capabilities that ease living would never provide. The seventh rule is the rule of cognitive hygiene, which involves maintaining the same careful attention to the quality of your thoughts that you would give to the quality of your physical environment or diet. Just as you wouldn't deliberately consume toxic food or live in polluted air, the Stoics understood that consuming toxic thoughts, whether generated internally or absorbed from external sources, degrades your psychological health and effectiveness. This rule requires developing discrimination about which thoughts deserve your attention and which ones are better left unexamined. Not every thought that arises in consciousness is worth pursuing. Not every worry deserves detailed analysis. Not every fantasy deserves extended exploration. Some thoughts are like junk mail, automatically generated mental noise that can be recognized and discarded without guilt or elaborate processing. The practice involves regularly cleaning house in your mental environment, just as you might regularly clean your physical living space. You become selective about the media you consume, the conversations you engage in, and the mental habits you reinforce through repetition. You notice which thoughts tend to generate productive insights or positive emotions, and which ones create endless loops of worry, resentment, or distraction. Like a gardener who cultivates beneficial plants while removing weeds, you learn to cultivate thoughts that serve your growth while allowing unconstructive mental patterns to naturally fade through lack of attention. The eighth rule is the rule of emotional non-resistance, which paradoxically suggests that fighting against unwanted emotions often intensifies and prolongs them, while accepting their presence without judgment allows them to move through your system more naturally. This doesn't mean becoming passive or indifferent to your emotional life, but recognizing that emotions, like weather patterns, tend to be temporary and self-resolving when not fed by resistance or excessive analysis. The Stoics observed that suffering often contains two components: the initial pain of the situation and the additional pain of fighting against that pain. Someone hurts your feelings, and you experience both the hurt and the anger at yourself for being hurt. You feel afraid of something, and you experience both the fear and the shame of being afraid. You feel sad about a loss, and you experience both the sadness and the frustration at not being able to just get over it. The second layer of suffering is always optional and often more debilitating than the original emotion. Practicing emotional non-resistance involves allowing emotions to be present without needing to fix, change, or eliminate them immediately. You feel angry, and instead of judging the anger as wrong or trying to force yourself to feel differently, you simply acknowledge, anger is here right now. You feel anxious, and instead of fighting the anxiety or feeding it with worst-case scenarios, you notice anxiety is moving through this system. This acceptance doesn't mean you like the emotion or want it to stay forever, but you stop adding the extra layer of suffering that comes from resisting what's already present. The ninth rule is the rule of philosophical perspective, which involves regularly expanding your viewpoint beyond immediate circumstances to include larger contexts of time, space, and meaning. The Stoics understood that emotional mastery often involves a kind of cognitive zooming out, seeing your current challenges within broader frameworks that restore proportion and reveal opportunities for growth that might not be visible from inside the intensity of immediate experience. Marcus Aurelius regularly practiced exercises in expanding perspective. He would contemplate how his current difficulties compared to the vast sweep of human history, how his individual problems fit within the larger patterns of natural change and development, and how his temporary troubles might contribute to his long-term character development. This wasn't about minimizing genuine difficulties or pretending problems don't matter, but about seeing them within contexts that prevented him from becoming overwhelmed or losing sight of what was most important. The practice might involve asking yourself questions like, how will I view this situation in 5 years? What would someone I deeply respect advise me about this challenge? How might this difficulty be serving my growth in ways I can't currently see? What would handling this situation with grace and wisdom look like? These questions don't eliminate the reality of difficult circumstances, but they often reveal possibilities and resources that aren't visible when you're completely absorbed in immediate emotional reactions. The 10th and final rule is the rule of virtuous response, which states that regardless of what emotions or thoughts arise, you always retain the power to respond in ways that align with your deepest values and commitments. This is perhaps the most empowering discovery of Stoic psychology. External circumstances can influence your emotional and mental experience, but they cannot determine the quality of character you express through your responses. Even in the midst of intense emotions or challenging circumstances, the option to respond with courage, wisdom, justice, and temperance remains available. This rule transforms your relationship with difficult emotions from seeing them as problems that prevent virtuous action to seeing them as the very contexts within which virtue is developed and expressed. You can feel angry and still choose to speak with integrity. You can feel afraid and still choose to act with courage. You can feel sad and still choose to treat others with kindness. You can feel confused and still choose to seek wisdom rather than react impulsively. The Stoics discovered that virtue, excellence of character, is not dependent on feeling good or having clarity about outcomes. Virtue is always available as a choice in the present moment, regardless of your emotional state or external circumstances. This doesn't mean forcing yourself to act in ways that contradict your authentic feelings, but recognizing that your feelings don't have to dictate your choices. You can acknowledge your emotions while choosing your responses based on who you want to become rather than how you currently feel. When you begin to integrate these 10 rules into your daily experience, something remarkable happens. You discover that mastery over emotions and thoughts doesn't mean never having difficult feelings or challenging thoughts. Instead, it means developing such a fundamentally different relationship with your inner world that these experiences lose their power to derail your peace, compromise your values, or prevent you from living according to your deepest wisdom. This mastery isn't about perfection or about never being affected by life's challenges. It's about developing resilience, wisdom, and freedom in the midst of whatever arises. You become someone who can feel deeply without being controlled by feelings, think clearly without being trapped by thoughts, and respond wisely without being driven by impulses. This is what the Stoics called the good life, not a life free from difficulty, but a life lived with such inner mastery that external circumstances become largely irrelevant to your fundamental well-being and effectiveness. The beautiful paradox of this approach is that as you become less controlled by emotions and thoughts, you often become more emotionally alive and mentally clear. When you're not constantly defending against difficult feelings, you become more available to positive ones. When you're not trapped in loops of anxious thinking, You become more capable of creative and practical problem solving. When you're not at the mercy of every fluctuation in your inner weather, you become more present to the beauty and meaning available in ordinary moments. These rules work not by suppressing your humanity, but by expressing it more skillfully. They don't make you less sensitive, but more discerning. They don't eliminate your emotions, but teach you to dance with them rather than being trampled by them. They transform you from someone who has lived by their psychological patterns into someone who lives from conscious choice, wisdom, and virtue regardless of what emotions or thoughts happen to be present. What would your life look like if you truly trusted your ability to handle whatever emotions or thoughts might arise? What risks might you take? What dreams might you pursue? What service might you offer if you knew that your peace and effectiveness didn't depend on feeling good or having everything figured out? The Stoic path of emotional and mental mastery is an invitation to discover the profound freedom that becomes available when you stop being hostage to the fluctuations of your inner world and start living from the unshakable core of conscious choice that exists within every moment.